Welcome to the K-State Regen Ag Pod, where we talk all things regenerative agriculture here at Kansas State University, across the state of Kansas and beyond. I'm Nick Detter, your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kraig Roozeboom, Professor Emeritus of Cropping Systems for the Kansas State University Department of Agronomy, and currently a research consultant for the Kansas Soybean Commission. Kraig is joining me today to talk about his career, including his research on topics such as cropping system intensification and diversification in northeast and north central Kansas. Kraig, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Nick.
I think just to start, if you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your career at K-State, and if you want, also a little bit about the role that you're currently doing.
Sure. So I grew up in Iowa on a small, diversified farm. We had crops, but hogs and cattle. And my father was one of the first producers in the area to use no-till. And so I was exposed to that at an early age, installed a lot of terraces on our rough south central Iowa ground. And that spurred the interest and went on to get a degree in agriculture at a small Christian college and master's degree at Iowa State, and then landed here at K-State in 1990 and had a 35-year career here at K-State. 3 different jobs. For 16 years, I managed their crop performance testing program, working with most of the crops grown in the state, all over the state. Then for 6 years, I was Extension Cropping Systems Specialist. Again, got all over the state, talked a lot about cropping systems, started working in cover cropping at that time. And then for the last 13 years or so of my career, I was in a research and teaching position in cropping systems and continued a lot of the work I had initiated in my extension time and expanded on that. I retired in August of 25, so a little over 6 months ago maybe. And in March, I started a part-time position with the Kansas Soybean Commission as their research consultant, helping them to identify research projects that will maximize the return on their investment from the checkoff funds.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to out of that new role and coming and talk to us a little bit about what you had been doing with K-State over time. So I think my first question is, as you mentioned that your focus was kind of in cropping systems, could you just describe to us the typical growing environment and the typical cropping systems of north central and northeast Kansas?
Sure. And what's interesting to me about this is it's evolved over the years. Historically, and when I started at K-State, there was a fair amount of wheat and grain sorghum, lots of grain sorghum in that region. Although the far northeast corner has been corn and soybeans for decades, but that footprint of the corn belt, corn-soybean rotation has expanded and continues to expand and reaches into north central Kansas and into central Kansas even. Not to say that there's no wheat or no sorghum left, there still is, and I think there are opportunities with those crops, even in this region, but the cropping systems have changed, and a lot of that has to do with the productivity. It's generally productive soils. There's some irrigation, but it's not nearly as heavily dependent on irrigation in this part of the state as some other parts of the state. Generally, irrigation kind of raises the production floor. There are challenges. There are a lot of eroded hillsides where it's tough to be very productive, and so you'll find CRP and some of that. There's still a fair amount of pasture and range in the region, which is what a lot of that ground is well suited for. So, as I said, probably less diverse than it was 30 years ago. And probably less diverse also in terms of livestock integration. There's still livestock on the landscape, But in terms of integrated into the cropping system on more acres, it's less integrated into the cropping system now than it was 30 years ago, I would say. There are cow-calf operations, far fewer feeders. Things have been concentrated over the years into the larger operations.
Well, with that kind of shift, how do you think some of these regen ag practices, or whatever terminology you like to use, such as reduced or no tillage, or maybe even cover crops, or you just mentioned that livestock integration is kind of on the decline. Where would some of those practices fit into these cropping systems currently in north central and northeast Kansas?
Yeah, I would say reduced till, no till has already had a big impact in the region. It's got, I can't put a number to the percent of acres, but it's a significant portion of the acres has some sort of a reduced or straight no-till. And I think that's still growing. Now there's, with herbicide-resistant weeds developing resistance to herbicides, there's some shifts to more tillage occasionally. But in this part of the state, I think the no-till acres continue to grow. And so that's been a long-term thing, decades. And that's been, I think, a big win, both in terms of soil conservation, obviously, the biggest one, and just general environmental impact. In the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years, cover crops have been making inroads, and that I think that continues to grow as well, probably not as rapidly. And this is where livestock integration generally comes in, because many of the folks who are making cover crops make it a viable part of their operation, do it through grazing. That's where they're recovering the cost. And there's research showing that even with grazing, we're getting a lot of the benefits that we hope to get from that cover crop in terms of its impact on soils and soil loss and things like that.
Well, could you talk a little bit about how some of your research in trying to intensify and diversifying these systems that, maybe you were kind of almost swimming against the stream a little bit. It sounds like that in the region, systems were generally getting more simplified and less diversified. So how did some of your research help maybe offer some alternative perspectives and alternative approaches to cropping systems in this region?
Right. It kind of, as I said, I don't know if I'd say I got on the cover crop bandwagon early, but at least relatively early in that process. And so just documenting the viability of cover crops and how to fit those in to the systems of this region, and just documented how, yes, and especially when you start diversifying the system by maybe taking a step back, but if you have wheat in the system, you've got that winter grass crop that you can rotate to, and you open up a lot of other opportunities for viable grazing and potential nitrogen fixation. We documented the ability to reduce nitrogen rates on a subsequent sorghum crop when we had a summer legume after wheat in there. We weren't grazing it, but we were able to document the agronomic benefits. Double crop soybeans even though not a cover crop, it's an intensification avenue, and where you've got a product to sell economically, that's been one of the better ways to attack intensification, is just double cropping. And whether we've worked with soybeans, but others and farmers have been doing more and more double cropping with even corn and sorghum, probably a little further west, more central Kansas, where you'll often, or south central Kansas, where you'll see that. But again, ways to keep that land productive, keep the soil active, the soil microbiome active, living roots in the soil, those kinds of things that that has all been beneficial. And obviously when you have a product to sell, whether it's additional grain harvested or gain on livestock through grazing, makes that economically viable for the producer. So a fair amount of work in cover crops. What's been their impact on subsequent crops? So looking at the whole rotation and just water use. Soil water use is always a concern, less so in this part of the state than in some other parts of the state, but there are years, and combined with certain management practices, say winter cover crops terminated late, you can have a tremendous impact, negative impact on the next cash crop if you're not careful. And so putting some numbers to that, the other kind of general area of emphasis that I've worked on over the years had more to do with diversification, although it's always related to intensification to some extent. There's a lot of overlap there, and so working with other crops. Canola, I don't know if you'd call it an alternative crop anymore, but it's not on a lot of acres yet. Still feel that it has a nice fit, probably in more southern, south central Kansas, but it can be grown successfully in this part of the state, up all the way up through north central Kansas, and adds a nice rotational option, and also a different market stream. It's a winter oil seed, and so you're able to capture some of those summer oilseed peak prices and when you go to marketing it. So done some work with that. A little bit of work with sesame. That, again, was more south central Kansas. And more recently with hemp. And the CBD bubble has burst. But there's still potential out there and slowly establishing a fiber industry. I think how active it is in the state, there is some activity. And there's a fair amount of activity on one of the Native American reservations in northeast Kansas, really making their presence known in that space. And so we did some work mainly focused on, okay, how much water does hemp use? There's been a lot of claims about its water use efficiency, and so documenting what that looks like and just adding to the scientific knowledge base of hemp in this region and for grain and fiber production rather than CBD production. So those are some of the things, and I think that diversification thing, that's a tough thing, because you can figure out all the production issues, but if you can't market it, it's tough. Yep. I forgot to mention, done some work with field peas, and again, probably a better fit in northwest Kansas. We looked at it in this region, but it just can't compete with soybeans in terms of productivity in our environments. Kind of the other area we've looked at, I mentioned cover crops, but working with some of my colleagues in soil fertility, looking at the interaction of cover cropping and nutrient management, mostly around phosphorus. We actually looked at nitrogen contributions in these other studies as well, but looking at phosphorus and reducing phosphorus losses because of the likelihood for eutrophication. And I don't know if it would be surprising, but other research has now confirmed that the outcomes you get from incorporating a cover crop may not always be what you would be led to believe just reading the popular press, because we documented, and other researchers have documented as well in other locations now, at least the potential in certain situations increase in dissolved phosphorus losses when you have a cover crop in place. Definite improvements in and reductions in particulate phosphorus losses and soil erosion. Those go together. So you've got big benefits there, but you've got to be aware of the potential anyway for greater losses of dissolved phosphorus
What was the mechanism that from the cover crops that was kind of causing that increase in dissolved phosphorus loss?
That's a good question. A lot of, I don't know if we defined it specifically, but one of the things is you're growing more biomass, you're putting more biomass on the surface of the soil and bringing that phosphorus up from the soil profile and laying it on the surface, and it's in contact, often higher moisture content at near soil surface under a cover crop residue, making it more, keeping it in solution and more susceptible to losses. And so it's very dependent on the year and timing and amounts of rainfall and things like that. If we have a big rainfall year with lots of intense events where particulate erosion potential is big, then cover crops are helping us, no doubt. If it's, more spread out, lighter rainfall events, we may be actually increasing some of our phosphorus losses. So it's complex. And so that's been interesting. And I think understanding the interactions and the interplay of all these different strategies and management, things you need to think about, has been interesting and hopefully informative for the agricultural community.
Yeah, could you summarize? I mean, like it sounds like you've had a lot of different studies kind of looking at different portions of how cover crops kind of fit into cropping systems in this region. I mean, would you have some general tips or things that producers that are maybe wanting to get into the cover crop space for the first time, like based off of your years of research, things that they should be conscious of as they're trying to integrate those cover crops into their systems?
Yeah, and this isn't anything new. People have been saying this for a long time, but kind of the low-hanging fruit there, or a first step in, would be cereal rye after corn before soybeans. I wouldn't say it's foolproof, but it's a low hurdle to get over. Cereal rye is fairly cheap. A lot of producers still do have drills. You can put it out there, and the yield impact on soybeans seldom is negative, and there are lots of benefits in terms of weed suppression, which is obviously a big deal in soybean production as we think about herbicide resistance in our weed populations. And so that's kind of a first step. We've had much less success with cereal rye after soybeans ahead of corn, and I think it can be done. You just need to be a lot more careful about it. And other broadleaf winter annuals are a little more challenging to get enough growth on to be of much benefit. So that would be kind of the entry point. It would be something ahead of soybeans. They're generally less sensitive to what's happened before just because they're fixing their own nitrogen. They tend to be planted a little later, although that's changing, especially in northeast Kansas. A lot of soybeans are going in at the same time or even before corn to push yields, but then the interaction with sudden dust syndrome and other things comes into play as well. So all things to keep in mind in that space.
I know that you've done some work too on the profitability of these systems. What were some of the general takeaways from when you're incorporating cover crops, how to make them most profitable? And or maybe I'll make the question more broad: as you're intensifying your system, what are some of the key takeaways of how that can relate to profitability?
Yeah, I'll first speak to our specific research, which is a long-term study where we were inserting cover crops after wheat and before sorghum. And again, that wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation is kind of back. We don't see as much of that anymore. But in that situation, if we could have a summer legume cover crop, we could reduce our nitrogen inputs to the sorghum and maintain yield, roughly 40 pounds per acre on average over years. And I mentioned double crop soybeans. If we added those in instead of the cover crop, we could actually increase profitability. And some of our more recent work would show we're getting maybe not as many of the soil health benefits in terms of building carbon and things like that, but we're better than not having something there after the wheat.
Was there a nitrogen credit also if you did double crop soybeans ahead of your sorghum, or was it only if you did like a legume cover crop?
Yeah, we saw it seldom would take more nitrogen, but we definitely would not get it as big of a nitrogen credit. If at the most it would be like a 10 to 20 pound credit after the double crop soybeans. I think one of the you're harvesting a lot of the nitrogen in the grain with the double crop soybeans as compared to the forage soybeans where you're leaving it out there.
So I think my next question, and this actually, maybe in some ways relates to your current position you're serving in, where you're kind of on the, you were a researcher for a long time, and now you're actually helping the Kansas Soybean Commission kind of evaluate what research they want to fund. So I guess when this topic of Regen Ag comes up, what questions do you think need to still be answered? Whether there are things kind of lingering from your own research that you wish could still have been answered, or if just in more general, as you kind of approach this topic and think about this topic, where you think what things you think need to be answered to help producers, work with these practices.
Yes, and it may be an indirect effect on producers through maybe affecting market signals, but we've documented little pieces here and there, right? So you include a cover crop at this point in this rotation, maybe we can reduce nitrogen inputs, or we're building carbon over time, or we're having an impact on nitrous oxide emissions. But developing a little more robust picture of what the carbon footprint is for these practices, what the impact of these practices are, incorporating incorporating both carbon sequestration plus greenhouse gas emissions, those kinds of things, along with the production costs, and getting both that carbon footprint plus the economic analysis, a bigger picture system-wide life cycle analysis type thing. I think very little has been done in that space around regenerative ag practices per se. And part of the problem is, everybody's going to do it a little differently, right? And so how do you put together the package to get more of a systems evaluation? So if we're able to paint a better picture about just what the carbon footprint is of these practices, again, how these market signals work or not, society is demanding a lower carbon footprint for their food, right? And so I think if we can figure out, or if the market can be structured in such a way to reward for those real, not just modeled, but at least better informed models of these practices, I think then we'll start to see traction on more acres, and not just the people who care, but the people who care a little bit but just can't seem to afford it, or what have you. But if the economics would shift just a little bit, I think we could see a greater adoption of these kind of practices.
Well, the last question I like to ask all my guests is just opening up the floor to you and asking what's something that's exciting to you currently, whether that's in your personal work, just the broader field of agronomy, or something you know that's going on around K-State.
Yeah, I think something that's encouraging to me is, as I mentioned earlier on, I grew a little bit of my youth, right? Exposure to no-till and terraces very early on when a lot of that was relatively new. And now seeing the grassroots interest in these kinds of practices, right? Regen Ag is the current term, but it shares that lineage back to conservation and soil health and all aspects of that. And I think the grassroots interest plus the, I don't know if you'd call it political, societal, structural mechanisms paying attention to it now. It's not necessarily a fringe idea anymore. And so that's interesting. I think there is, in my work with the Soybean Commission, I think soybean as a commodity probably does as good a job on this as any. They've kind of housed it in the term of sustainability, but they've been paying attention to that for many years, and obviously they're interested in the biofuel space through biodiesel. And I think a lot of these things, there are connections there that would hopefully move the whole system in more of a sustainable, regenerative direction.
Kraig, thank you for joining me, and everybody, thank you for tuning in to the K-State Regen Ag Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.